All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest. This is David, and welcome to PacWest Bigfoot. And as promised, as I said, guys, every other week I'm going to bring you a based on true encounter story from around the Bigfoot world here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. And real quick, I just want to say I hope that you and your family had the most wonderful Thanksgiving. And I just wanted to say thank you so very much for following along, to sitting through commercials before the videos happen so that this can all be paid for. And here is something else, and I kind of hope that I'm the first one here to say this, but Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas to you and to your family. And I'm telling you this real quick. Literally, it is our prayer this evening. This family is going to sit down and during our Bible study and do a little prayer time, and it's going to be our prayer that you have one of the most wonderful Christmases this season, this year, that you've ever had. Okay? All right. With that, let's get into this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. Another Christmas tree farm, another Bigfoot encounter in Oregon. And yes, I have a mint in my mouth, and I'm going to sip my coffee. I was almost 13 years old when I would see a Bigfoot, and not for the first time in my life, but twice. And both times were on what was once a Christmas tree farm in southern Oregon back in the late 1960s. Christmas tree farms back then were growing in popularity. My grandfather had started one back east before my family moved out west in the 1940s, one of the first ones back then. But here is what I saw, and my parents feared afterwards in the Pacific Northwest. The Christmas tree farm. As I said, my grandfather started the business back east, and my mother and father continued the new family tradition after moving west in the early to mid 1950s. Back then, there was not a lot of talk of Bigfoot as there was after the film made in Northern California in the 60s, but there was some, and even I heard about it from friends in school and church when we moved out here. My mom and dad, however, told me that the idea of Bigfoot was much like the idea of Superman. It sounds fascinating, but that is all. A fascinating fairy tale. But even their minds were changed about that around 10 years later, give or take a year. They had purchased some property outside of a decent-sized town back then called Eugene, Oregon. It was located a bit out of town in the country, but there was plenty of room to start seed and sit back and work a regular job while the crop grew to maturity. Back then, there were some old folks that thought growing Christmas trees in Oregon was a bit, well, honestly, they thought my folks were off their rocker. But that would soon prove to be wrong. It was a great business idea, just as it had been back east. But I do not want to take up too much time with that. What I want to say, though, is that my parents did find some concern about Bigfoot even before I had seen the thing the first time. Hot chocolate and footprints. We were about a year or two from the film that would capture the attention of the world and the idea or possible existence of Bigfoot. And just so you know, I know for a fact that the one in that film was pretty spot on. However, I think I saw a male. But we'd made it nearly 10 years or so, and I remember because that early September I celebrated my birthday on a Saturday, although the actual day was on a Monday. And by the end of November, it had snowed a bit unexpectedly, I recall as well. Nothing over the top, but a decent little dusting one morning. By that point, my dad had the house built, and heading out to the farm was heading back to the back door of the house through the screen in back porch and about 30 yards into the thick of them. And we'd already been asked for some trees from quite a few stores and other businesses around southern Oregon. It was really neat. My mom and dad were really excited to see that there was already a demand for them, even in the land of evergreen. We had Douglas fir for the most part, but we also grew some noble fir and others. But I can't recall the name. It was so long ago of all of them. My dad and I were to go out and look at some of the seedlings after the bitterly cold night and make sure no issues were arising. Pine is a pretty hardy tree, but even seedlings can be a bit susceptible to winter cold when so young. Everything was good, except for one curious thing we found: footprints. With hot cocoa in hand, my dad was the first to notice them. They were pretty huge, I remember. Both of us actually stepped in one. It was at least a couple inches wider than my dad's foot. I'd say at least 4 inches, give or take longer. And he was wearing boots. I know it sounds cliche, but he was standing there as he took off his famous redneck cap and scratched his head, wondering who in the world was running around in the cold barefoot through our tree farm. We continued checking the trees and started marking the ones that would be cut and sent to the local stores and businesses for sale. Afterward, my dad did make a wide circle around the property after that, just to see if anyone was out and about on the property unawares. He did mention it to my mom, who, of course, had to go out and check it out for herself. She was stunned a bit as well, but I could tell she did seem to have a more worried look about her compared to my dad. Howling at the winter moon. We had a two-story house, a very classic Victorian-looking home for the time. My bedroom window faced the tree farm itself and the mountains. Well, at least what I called big hills beyond. It was about a week later, after we found the footprints, that I would hear some pretty crazy stuff at night. And I know I was not dreaming it up, as my mother would hear it too, and we'd both find ourselves spending some quality time together listening to it from my room. I believed it was Bigfoot, the one I'd seen soon enough. But it was the weekend, and we'd been cutting and loading some of the trees for delivery on Monday and all day Friday, and that day, Saturday. My dad and I were pretty tired, so we both headed to bed somewhat early. The next day, we would continue and skip church that Sunday. It was around 11 p.m. when I woke up to go to the bathroom, and when I came back, is when I thought I had heard something, or someone outside. I opened my window a bit, and sure enough, I could hear what sounded like howling. It was seconds later that I would hear and turn to see my mother standing at the door, asking me if I could hear it too. We sat by the window listening for what seemed about an hour, but was more like 20 minutes before it ended. She had me get back in bed, and in the morning we were once again confronted with new footprints. But this time there were sounds in the night to go with the mystery that was unfolding. However, the mystery was put aside long enough each day to cut trees and get them off to market. Nothing would stop the work, not even Bigfoot. My dad and mom were intrigued enough, however, to hang out in the cold in the evening on the back porch, listening and watching for any sign of whomever or whatever was coming around at night. Ghost in the trees. It was the first week of December when I'd first get a glimpse, or better yet, a blur of a sighting at best. Something was moving in and out of the trees, something big and something black. My dad had trusted me enough to fall some of the trees, and I was pretty good at it, I have to admit. The day before, he hurt his wrist, and I was going to do some of the falling that day, so I got up early, grabbed some cocoa, and headed out. The sun was not completely up, but there was enough light to get started anyway. The few nights before had been relatively quiet, and I mean no more howling in the night from the hills beyond the property was heard. The footprints had disappeared as well. We had not seen any since the week before Thanksgiving. I started on a tree when I noticed what looked like legs suddenly walk past a few trees about 2 or 3 rows in front of me. Shocked for a second there, I stood up thinking it was my dad who finally made his way outside. To my surprise and shock, it was not my dad that I saw so briefly. What I did see was a tall, dark figure run out of sight as fast as it took my eyes to see it in the first place. Basically, it was in the blink of an eye that I had seen a tall, dark ghost of a thing disappear into the forest that skirted the edge of the farm. I ran to the house and told my mom, who was up already, about what I had just seen. She came out, and the two of us came upon some tracks in the wet, short grass and mud that the early snow and rainy night had created. Toes on a couple were pretty obvious, but for the most part, they were just a bunch of really big impressions that spanned heel to toe as far as I could stretch my legs. My mother and father did become a little worried about the event, especially since I was alone out there in the morning, with little light, while someone they thought was wandering around, possibly trying to steal a tree. I told them that it could not have been a person. Even though it was the briefest of seconds, I had seen this thing run off. I still saw enough to understand that this was a Bigfoot. My mom and dad, of course, said it was a person over and over, as if I would be convinced if they said it enough. But not even close. I know what I saw. Soon enough, they'd know it too. This thing was big, dark, and ran faster than anything I'd ever seen. And I mean fast. It was like, literally, a ghost in the trees. Merry Christmas, you filthy animal. The trees had been all cut and shipped out. It was quite a happy day for my mom and dad. They really did make a killing with those trees. All the time and money invested panned out and made them pretty comfortable for some time. There was some cleanup to do and one other non-work related thing to do that week before Christmas. Pick out our own Christmas tree. That was my job. The howling was back and had been heard a couple times up to that day, the week before Christmas. One of those late evenings, all three of us would sit in my bedroom listening as if we were huddled around the radio listening to a mystery show that we still did even back then from time to time. Yes, we had a television, but the radio was still fun too. But without warning and forgetting for a moment events that had happened recently and the excitement of getting that tree in the house before they woke up, I decided to go get a tree early that morning. I headed out the back door to the shed and grabbed a saw. I then started to walk through the trees that were left, which were few and far between, other than the young ones. I finally found one, not a noble fir, of course. We kept those for customers, and we gave some away to charities. I was sawing when I heard something behind me. It was like a huff mixed with a sudden and guttural sounding growl. I was scared to death. I knew what it was. I just knew it even before I turned around. However, slowly but surely, I did turn around. It stunk something awful. I was surprised I did not notice it before, but then again, a breeze did stir up a bit, and a bitterly cold one. But the shaking and trembling I started to experience did not come from the cold. It came from the monster that was standing literally within 20 feet of me. I found myself staring at and could smell the ugliest looking animal or thing I'd ever seen, and the biggest. It was pitch black in color, and its hair covered the entire body of this thing, except for a particularly large portion of the face. I remember this thing like it was yesterday. It was a pretty defining moment in my life. The face, that was the scariest part. Its eyes were huge and dark, but I could see some off-white, even a bit of yellow tint to them, and they looked like eyes, not holes, with red glints to them. The skin was really, well, I just don't have any words for it. It was dark, but nowhere near as dark as the hair, and it was so long it would blow in the breeze. His shoulders were massive, and I would put that thing today at around 8 feet tall, give or take a few inches or so. Either way, it was really, really tall. It was just standing there, growling the whole time and I wanted to scream. I could see some of its teeth when it suddenly gave me a scowl kind of a look. It flipped its lip, the top one, up at me. Even though I saw no real neck on this thing, it did flip its head back as it huffed yet again, then made that guttural growl once more. Suddenly, at that moment, it turned and ran off like it did that morning I'd seen it the first time, and once again, like a ghost, it vanished into the trees and off into the forest. Dear Dad, my mom and dad were a bit upset that I'd gone out there that morning alone. I was previously told not to, at least not in the early morning or at night without telling them. But I told them what I saw, and that is what we were hearing at night from time to time. About a week after Christmas that year, some friends of my parents from church had come over for dinner. My dad and the other gentleman, I won't mention his name either, but they both chatted about what had happened. That was when a floodgate of information and stories of the area through the years about Bigfoot came hurling from this guy. It was extremely interesting to hear. That was for sure. We kept hearing howls in the night and even a few screams over the next year or so. Not too often, but here and there. Eventually, they died off, and the Bigfoot moved on as more people, I suppose, moved out this way and most likely pushed them back further into the forests. 6 years later, just after more and more successful Christmas seasons on the farm, we had to move, me and my mother. My dad unexpectedly passed away. Apparently, he had some sort of heart condition. Not even he had known about. Something he was born with, they said. But up until she passed away, my mother would tell the story of to her grandchildren, my kids, of the tree farm and the Bigfoot. And today, well, I share it with my grandchildren. But that is my encounter story. Thanks. Thomas.